History is often shaped by massive political shifts, but this story begins with something much smaller, a childhood conversation between two boys that eventually set the stage for a war that left no survivors. In an ancient forest school, Prince Drupada and a poor sage's son named Drona grew up as equals. In the eyes of their teacher, their birth didn't matter, only their skill. During their final days at school, Drupada made a specific offer to his friend. He promised that when he inherited his father's throne, he would give Drona exactly half of the kingdom so they could remain equals forever. By phrasing his affection as a specific transaction, half of a kingdom, Drupada set a precise price on their bond. It meant that for the rest of his life, Drona would view their friendship not as a feeling, but as an unpaid debt. Years later, the reality of the world set in. Drupada became the king of Panchala, surrounded by gold and armed guards. Drona, meanwhile, lived in a shack, unable to provide basic comforts for his son Ashwathama. Remembering the promise of the half-kingdom, Drona walked into Drupada's palace. He wasn't there to beg, he was there to collect on a debt from a man he still considered his best friend. Drupada didn't just say no. He told Drona that friendship can only exist between people of the same status. Since Drona was a beggar and Drupada was a king, the king argued that their childhood bond had effectively expired the moment they left school. Drona left the palace without a word, but his perspective had shifted. He stopped seeing Drupada as a friend who had forgotten him and started seeing him as a target. He decided that if Drupada only respected those with status, Drona would take that status by force. Drona traveled to neighboring Hastinapur, becoming military instructor for the Kuru princes. He trained Arjuna into a master archer, intending to use him against Panchala. When training ended, Drona demanded payment, march into Panchala and capture King Drupada alive. Drona had spent decades teaching these boys how to fight, but their first real mission wasn't for the defense of the kingdom. It was to satisfy their teacher's personal grudge. The plan worked. Arjuna's arrows broke the Panchala defense, and Drupada was brought before Drona in chains, stripped of his crown and his pride. Drona then took his half. He partitioned Drupada's kingdom, keeping the northern territory for himself and leaving the southern half to Drupada. He told Drupada that because they now both owned exactly half of the original kingdom, they were finally equals again. He invited Drupada to be his friend, now that the status issue had been resolved. In his attempt to prove Drupada wrong, Drona had actually adopted Drupada's logic. He now believed that the only way to be friends was to hold the same amount of land and power. He had become the very person who had insulted him years before. Drupada returned to his diminished kingdom, but he couldn't eat or sleep. The fact that Drona had spared his life and given him back half the land was the ultimate humiliation. Realizing he could never beat Drona in a fair fight, Drupada turned to the supernatural. He performed a massive fire ritual, fueled by his hatred, asking the gods for a son born for one reason, to kill Drona. Out of the flames stepped Dhrishtadyumna. He wasn't a child who grew up to be a warrior. He was a manifestation of a grudge, born with armor and weapons, specifically designed to be the end of Drona's life. The conflict had moved past two old men arguing about a promise. It had evolved into a biological reality where a human being was brought into the world solely to serve as a murder weapon. When the Great War at Kurukshetra finally broke out, Drona and Drupada found themselves standing on opposite sides of the battlefield. What began as a schoolyard friendship had become a central driver of a war involving millions of soldiers. On the 15th day of the battle, Dhrishtadyumna found Drona. As Drona sat in meditation, his spirit already leaving his body, Dhrishtadyumna beheaded him, fulfilling the purpose of the fire ritual. But the cycle didn't stop. In retaliation for his father's death, Drona's son snuck into the enemy camp at night and killed Dhrishtadyumna and all of Drupada's remaining children. Within a few days, every single heir in both families was dead. When friendship is measured in hectares and infantry, it stops being a relationship and starts being a balance sheet. Drona and Drupada spent their lives trying to settle that account, and in the end, the cost was everything they had.